Hello Year 9, hope everybody's well, not struggling with lockdown too much. I'm going to have another look at Lord of the Flies, the reading booklet, section 4 I'm going to look at today. It's the question that asks you to refer to the opening of the novel and make a note of the differences between Ralph and Piggy. So what I'm going to do is, rather than say Ralph is this and Piggy is this, I'm going to sort of be a little bit more, say, organic about this, because we're trying to think of concepts, not just dotting down quotes that will sort of lead to an ad hoc bit of a mess of a response in an exam. So we're trying to think from an early stage about concepts and methods, and don't get put off by the word concept. It just means a central idea that will draw other ideas towards it. So rather than just having lots of quotes, it's saying that here's a thought about Ralph or about Piggy, and how do we draw the quotes together that will help us to support that point or help us to argue against it. Okay, so I've come up with 5 concepts, and we've got a class of about 27, and we could have 27 different combinations of ideas, and that's perfectly fine. What you are expected to be able to prove in an exam is that you have engaged with the text and that you know lots of stuff, but also you know how to use it to argue a point. So, for example, if you were saying you think Piggy would make a better leader than Ralph, that you've got lots of information that would support you, even if other people could say, actually, I don't agree with you, or even if at some points you have to say, actually, this isn't very good evidence of what I'm trying to prove, but look here, I've got some better evidence. So this is something that could happen in lots and lots of ways. So whilst this isn't a straightforward answer to question 4, to section 4, it is about the first impressions that we get of Piggy and Ralph and comparing them to each other. And no two people should have the same answers, really, but I'm hoping that this will give you some idea of how you could proceed if you've struggled with getting into the characters of Piggy and Ralph. So the 5 areas that I've chosen to look at are what Golding tells us about their class, their social class, what we learn about their appearance and what that therefore tells us, the thoughts that they seem to be having at the beginning of the text in the whole of chapter 1, their response to there being no adults on the island, and the reaction that each of them has to Jack and the choir. So I'm going to go through those things bit by bit, and hopefully at some point be able to bring some of those ideas together into some kind of essay type response. So the first concept I want to think about is the class differences between Piggy and Ralph. How Golding makes it very clear from the very beginning of the novel that Piggy is working class and Ralph is upper middle class. It's perhaps a distinction that isn't quite as clear today as it would have been in the time that the novel is set. Lots more people today would consider themselves to be middle class. People with professions would probably consider themselves to be middle class. And at this time, Ralph seems to have a sort of very privileged life. So I've put him down as upper middle class. I mean, he's not quite upper class because he's not nobility or gentry, but he's somewhere towards that. Okay, so what's the evidence that Piggy is working class? Well, a method that Golding uses is to write the dialogue, the speech, in his accent. So when Piggy says hi, he's not saying hi as in hello, he's saying hey, because he wants Ralph to hold on. It's right at the beginning of the novel, he's spotted Ralph and he's kind of saying hey, hold on, but he pronounces it hi because he has this accent that sets him apart from the others later, because it's a very sort of London accent. He lives in Camberley, which is an overspill town from London. So I would say the word hey as hi. So if you've heard or know anybody with a London accent, they have slightly different vowel sounds than you have, and the people that you will know from different parts of the country. Also, Golding goes to lengths to show us that Piggy is a different class, because he doesn't use grammar in the same way that the others do. He will say something like can't hardly move for them creeper things. So very, very early on in the novel, he's showing that Piggy doesn't have the same level of education perhaps as Ralph does. And that Piggy's aunt's occupation is that she kept a sweet shop, and we learn this through Piggy's dialogue, through Golding making Piggy someone who has a lot to say about himself, and he is unashamedly working class, really. Now what he says is, excuse me, that his aunt kept a sweet shop, so she probably doesn't own it. It's probably a rental. However, running a sweet shop or running any kind of business is still quite something. So she wouldn't be sort of down in the dregs of the impoverished working classes. She'd be doing pretty well for herself if she was someone who ran a shop. So these are the things that we learn through dialogue and through the way Golding writes the accent and the way Golding writes his grammar. Now, in contrast to that, we know that Ralph is upper middle class because Golding chooses to give us this information, just as he has with Piggy saying that his aunt's occupation is to keep a sweet shop. Ralph tells Piggy that his father is in the Navy, and not just that he's in the Navy, that he's a commander. So the method is to emphasise Ralph's father's role. So we are not under any illusions about him being better off, being privileged, having advantage over Piggy, certainly in terms of social background. And we have something called a sociolect as well, and that's like the word social there. So the people that you are surrounded by all the time, which would be other English schoolboys, tend to use certain vocabulary just like you do. So in your little social grouping, you use particular words, and one of the words that Ralph and his friends use is wizzo. I think they might say wacko at some point as well, but even if they don't, it sort of belongs in that class of words that middle class or upper middle class schoolboys would use in their private school to express their excitement. So what methods has Golding used to illustrate that the two boys are from different classes? Well, he's written his dialogue in an accent. He's written it ungrammatically to illustrate the differences between the two. He's given us information. He's just used dialogue for the boys to pass on information about themselves. And he's incorporated Ralph's sociolect into the dialogue as well. So if we're looking at concepts, the concept of class and how we know, and the methods that have been used, then that's a good starting point for looking at the differences between Ralph and Piggy. So then let's move on to differences that we understand through Ralph and Piggy's appearance. It's never going to be good enough to just jot down points about appearance or class or thoughts or reactions. You've got to follow a line of thinking and develop ideas. So hopefully, even though I've only got a few things written down here, hopefully some of the things I say will develop some of these ideas. And even if you don't agree with them, or even if I went on to change my mind later, or I said something that seemed to contradict my original idea, the idea that you're thinking things through and that idea is prompted simply by something that you've read in the text or something that you understand from the text is something that would lead you to writing a thorough and detailed answer about methods in an exam. So let's have a look at these two boys then and the difference in their appearances. Well, we know that Piggy is fat, he has glasses, and he has a button nose, and we know that Ralph is athletic and attractive. What methods does Golding use to emphasise this? Well, he makes repeated references to being fat, and he even calls him the fat boy. Okay, so that's how Piggy's identified from very early on, before we know his name, and his name is never a surprise to us, is it? So, you know, if we're talking about details and developing thinking, you add in, well, when he reveals that his name is Piggy, it's no surprise because he is the fat boy, and he's got this button nose, which is a nose that's pushed up, so it actually looks like a button face on, which then we think, oh, that looks like a pig's snout. So he really is. He's made to seem physically unfortunate. So this fatness, you know. And I can't emphasise enough that Golding just doesn't miss an opportunity to let us know that Piggy is overweight, okay? Because he wants us to see him as being very, very out of place, just not suited at all for jungle life. So we start talking about one detail, him being overweight, and it leads us to all these other thoughts. Why is Golding doing it, and how is Golding doing it? Well, he keeps making repeated reference to how fat Piggy is, so that we've got this very clear impression that he's not suited to island life, and he's going to be very, very badly off. And building on this disadvantage, even though this isn't appearance, this is the kind of thing I mean by joining up your thinking, letting an idea, once you've pulled it apart, lead to another idea. So this idea that he's at disadvantage makes me think about Piggy's asthma as well. So he really isn't going to be well off in this environment. He's going to struggle in the jungle. But also that, you know, if you're asthmatic, then you need medication, and how long can he survive in that environment? So he's fat like a pig, and he's got asthma, so probably sometimes he wheezes as well, so he might even sound like a squealing pig from time to time. Now, you can completely disagree with that. You can sit there thinking, oh, come on, that's a bit much, it just sounds ridiculous, and it doesn't matter. The point is that if it's allowing you to make connections and think different things that aren't, you know, too far off the scale, that are still reasonable to think, then it doesn't matter what your interpretation is, and it needs to not just follow the herd and be the same as everybody else's. And then his clothing, he's clothed as though he's in England. He's got this wind cheater on. The Golding goes into detail to illustrate this picture of Piggy for us. He's not just got this wind cheater on, this coat that protects him from bad weather on this very, very hot island, and we know it's hot because Ralph is sticky and sweaty, but he's got it done right up to the top. Now that makes him sound like an extremely cautious boy who, which I've said in videos before, who still feels the pressure of adults on him. Okay, and I'm going to deal with adults in another section. And when he removes his clothes, he arranges his clothes very carefully, again, as though he's got an adult keeping an eye on him. But also Golding keeps making references to how careful Piggy is. He's a very cautious boy. I guess it's kind of suggests to us that he has been overprotected at home. So we know that he lives with his aunt. We know that he's unfortunate in that he's lost both of his parents and he has to live with his aunt. And as I said on this card here, his aunt runs a sweet shop, and Piggy says, I've got ever so many sweets, which sounds as though he's been overindulged in the past as well. So when he's being very careful, it's probably that he's been told he has to be very careful in life because he's got asthma and because he wears incredibly thick glasses. And he is carrying that care, that caution through to the island which, you know, he's probably wise to do. I mean, you know, you can, in a completely different environment, you're probably very sensible to be cautious. And then let's have a look at Ralph. So Ralph, by contrast, and this is definitely, to me, this is definitely Golding saying, look at the difference between these two. He has lost the prominent tummy of childhood. So prominent means sort of sticks out. So he's lost his little boy's rounded tummy, and he looks quite athletic. He looks as though he might one day be good at boxing. And actually, the actual quote is, he might make a boxer. And then Golding goes on to describe him in more detail. He says he has wide, heavy shoulders. So he's showing him to be very athletic. And then he makes him an attractive boy. He says he has a golden body. We already know that he has fair hair. So this golden body is continuing this impression of an idealised character. And in contrast to Piggy, he seems to be very well suited to life on the island. Definitely, if it was a sort of Hunger Games situation, we know which one would be better off. But for all his, as we go back to the other card quickly, for all his upper middle class traits compared to working class Piggy, he's actually the one that seems a bit more slobbish. When we first meet him, he's trailing his uniform behind him. I'm just going to focus that a bit better if I can. Yeah, he's trailing his uniform behind him, and when he wants to jump in the lagoon, wants to go swimming, he is he's impulsive. He just discards his clothes recklessly and goes towards the pool of water. So he's despite his class and his appearance, actually it's Piggy the one who acts in a more dignified manner. So we started talking about appearance. We used some evidence from the text. We talked a little bit about methods as well, which you have to do. And the conclusion is that it's not just straightforward, that Ralph is physically better, and in terms of his class seems a bit, well, he's definitely better off, he's definitely advantaged by the sounds of it, and is initially presented as the more idealised character, but actually it seems to be from quite an early stage that Piggy is the one who acts with more responsibility and dignity. And then if we move on to the thoughts that Piggy and Ralph have, the route I've chosen to go down is that Piggy is considerate and rational and sensitive, whereas Ralph is impulsive and insensitive, but that later his thoughts seem to settle a bit. And by the time we get onto this third concept, so we've done appearance and class so far, by the time we get onto a different focus, a different concept, we start to have ideas that will overlap with those that have gone already. Not all of them, but some of them. So I might end up repeating ideas, and that's actually reassuring, because it means that you have a lot of information that feeds into the same idea maybe. Anyway, let's see how it goes. So in terms of Piggy being considerate, he thinks of others when he's on the island. So Golding places in him a feeling of responsibility for other people. So this is the opposite. In fact, this is what I'm going to write down. Some of what he says at the beginning is all sort of me, let me think about me. So rather than just contrasting with Ralph, he contrasts with his earlier self. You know, he said, I've been wearing glasses, I've had asthma, and I live with my auntie, and these are all things about me. And he acts as though Ralph wants to be with him. He apologises for having to leave Ralph's side to go into the woods because he's got an upset stomach, into the jungle rather to have an upset stomach. But actually pretty soon he changes to think of others. We know that that's sort of mingled in with him thinking about himself. And if we're thinking about Golding placing Piggy being self-centered with Piggy being considerate towards others, we're thinking about structure. Okay, we might even be thinking about juxtaposition, but one method we're thinking of there is structure. So what is it that Piggy thinks of others? Well, he is worried about what's happened to other people. He gets upset and agitated when he thinks that there might be children who didn't get out of the plane, that there are children who didn't survive. He wants to know what to do, and he's very, very careful. So he's very thoughtful about his position, and that overlaps with this idea of him when he takes his clothes off. You know, taking his clothes off and arranging them carefully is a sort of physical sign of how thoughtful and considerate he is. So he's gets upset about others being dead, but he's also trying to think practically as well. He wants to know the situation. He tries to work out what has happened. He says, you know, so-and-so must have got out. Where's the man with the megaphone? So he's trying to work things out, and he works out that the plane must have flown off. He applies some logic. He says, no, I saw flames before the plane crashed. And this leads him to be pessimistic, to gain the idea that actually this is a really terrible situation to be in. And he says, he sort of undermines Ralph's ideas later on about his father, when Ralph says, oh, my daddy will come and get us, he's in the Navy. And he says, no, he won't, he doesn't know we're here, nobody knows we're here. So he's like the voice of doom, but it's also the voice of reality, the voice of realism. He can see clearly, and that links to the symbol of his glasses. So Golding chooses to symbolise that with using Piggy's glasses, but it does lead him to speak some very uncomfortable truths, and we've had to listen to some uncomfortable truths, haven't we? When lockdown started, you know, Boris was on TV saying this is going to be really hard, and actually lots of lives will be lost, and we are in that terribly sad situation where, you know, the life being hard a bit is fine, we'll get through it, but the deaths and the illness have been devastating for some people. But we can only get on and deal with that because we were told about the reality. Okay, so we've heard a lot about that in our own lives lately. But Piggy can only get on and deal with stuff because he's prepared to face the truth. Okay, if you do the opposite, then you're sort of what we call burying your head in the sand. It's a bit like not getting on and revising because you're not facing the fact that your exams are coming up very soon, and then you learn all too late that you should have just faced facts earlier on and got on with it. And then Piggy being sensitive, he's actually hurt by Ralph's betrayal of him. He doesn't understand when he tells Ralph that his nickname is Piggy, and of course we never learn his real name. He's actually too trusting and naive. He thinks that Ralph is going to be as loyal to him as he feels to Ralph. And again, Golding expresses that in a physical way by Piggy almost clinging to Ralph, not ever leaving his side. But also, and this links to what I was saying earlier up here, that he's upset by the idea of other people dying, particularly of children dying. So he does care about other people. So we've moved from the realms of thought into emotion, because you can't separate those two completely. And then when he's as part of this whole thinking of others and being upset by the suffering and the deaths of others, it also leads him to act in a very responsible adult way. He's the one who takes the names. He's the one who bothers to get to know, especially the little ones. He's the one who takes that parent's role. And I've said this in previous videos, and this is why sometimes I think you can argue that Piggy is the better leader. He shows more leadership qualities. And there's a really important quote quite early on, that all intelligence shown early on is traceable back to Piggy. You know, he's the one that has the more intelligent thoughts. So that's not, I haven't covered everything, but I've certainly covered enough to get your teeth into about Piggy in the first parts of the book. Let's move on to Ralph, because as opposed to being rational and logical, he is impulsive. He delights in the fantasy situation of being on an island, just like his books have had stories about. So he's sort of one of these characters in these adventure books where you get to go to an island and play at surviving. He doesn't realise the gravity of the situation yet. He just says in a sort of offhand way, oh, Daddy will come and get us. Daddy's in the Navy, he'll come and get us. So he thinks, you know, we've got time to play and have some fun, and then, you know, when we need to be rescued, Daddy will be there. And he ignores the logic, but Piggy won't let him forget the logic. Your dad doesn't know we're here. Nobody knows we're here. You know, we might die here, Piggy says. But Ralph doesn't want to face that. Okay, he doesn't want to face up to the gravity of the situation. At the moment, he's thinking, wow, this is just like what I've read about in a book, and I'm going to have some fun while I'm on this island. He also, I've put insensitive here. That changes later on, we know. But in terms of structure, we're talking about the very beginning of the book. So Golding has Ralph very early on betray Piggy's trust, so that we know that he is a flawed character. He's made him look physically as perfect as you could be. He's made him look like his physical ideal, but he does betray Piggy's trust. He Golding has emphasised Piggy's loyalty by having him, you know, stick to Ralph. And when Ralph tells Jack and the other boys that his name was Piggy, even though Piggy has said, I don't want anybody else to know my name, it's a real betrayal, and it hurts Piggy, hurts him a lot. But actually, even though he's flawed, and let's not forget that these are children, and you know, even adults will say stupid things and let people down. We do it all the time. Even though he's flawed, and he seems to be a little bit erratic and wound up in this fantasy at first, he does actually say quite early on that he's already started looking to see if it's an island. Now, you may be going, yeah, well, of course he has, because he wants to act out this fantasy that he's in a story like Coral Island or Swallows and Amazons. But we don't know that for sure. He has done some reconnaissance already. He has shown some leadership skills early on. So, you know, whilst Ralph seems, I mean, I get annoyed with Ralph early on. I do think Piggy's the better character early on. But, you know, you can't be completely for one over the other. And, you know, you do sort of think, well, come on, Piggy, it's time to just not worry about that now. We've got a job to do. So when Ralph, Jack and Simon are off to explore the island, and Piggy says, actually, do you know what, that really upset me. I asked you not to tell them that my nickname was Piggy. I think Ralph deals with it in a really good way, saying, you know, I'm sorry about that, but actually you stay here because you've got an important job to do. And he's absolutely right. Piggy does have an important job to do. He's the one that's he's like the teacher leading a school trip. He's the one that's responsible for the head count, and that job is seen to be really important early on when there's a fire on the island. And one of the boys who has stood out in Piggy's mind, because he's taking care, because he is this considerate, rational character, and when one of the boys is seen not to be around after the fire, it's Piggy who notices that he's missing. It's Piggy who knows that the fire has got out of hand, that the boys have been reckless, and that this little boy with the distinctive birthmark has died. Now, as I said before, there are lots of different things to say, and you might think, well, you know, you've missed out something really important. But let's face the reality: you've got about 45 minutes in GCSE to write an essay, including planning it and checking it. making sure that you've been detailed, making sure you've been thorough, making sure you stuck to an argument. So you wouldn't have masses and masses of ideas. But if you had a heading of thoughts, you might choose different evidence, and you might choose different points to break it down into as well. But that's the kind of the approach that I'm taking. Of course, it's all about methods too. What methods is Golding using? And because this is the start of the novel, so I'm going to repeat an idea here, because it's the start of the novel, we can say that he's using this method of structuring the novel in a way that sets the reader up for certain expectations. So, for example, we're initially led to believe that Ralph might be the perfect leader because he's physically perfect, but actually it's Piggy that's making all the most of the rational decisions at the beginning. Well, various arguments against that. So what do we learn about the way that Ralph and Piggy respond to the idea of there being no adults on the island? And what does that reveal about them? Well, Piggy is horrified, but he also takes responsibility. And Ralph is delighted that there are no adults around, and he seems to be quite irresponsible. Okay, although as we've found with these things, sometimes they're not as straightforward as they initially seem. So Piggy wants to know where the adult with authority is. You know, it's the first thing he wants to be able to do is to turn to a grown-up who can give them some kind of adult guidance. But when he realises that they're not there, even though he acts as though there's still an adult around, he still very much feels the presence of an adult in his aunt, which I've spoken about at length in other videos, so I won't go on about it here. He's startled. Okay, so when I say he's horrified, it's because Golding uses this adjective startled to describe his response to them not having that adult guidance. But more importantly, his response is to take the adult role. And he says, actually we'll have to do something. Even though when the children start emerging from the jungle, they look at Ralph because he's got the conch, and they look at him as though he's the one that's started to do something practical. And it's not. It's Piggy that's doing something practical. Ralph doesn't care about who comes out of the jungle. So what Golding then does is he describes Piggy's actions in a way that makes it clear to us that he's taking the adult role. So an adult thing to do is, and again I refer to someone leading a school trip, they make sure they know who's there, how many people are there. So Piggy starts taking the names as though he's a parent or a teacher. He definitely is doing something that's very grown up and responsible there. And when it says that he mutters the name to himself, that's like us repeating a phone number or a message over and over again so that we don't forget it. He really wants to remember these names. And then he's said to frown. He's frowning with effort in trying to remember the names as well. And then he tries to share the names with the others after the choir comes along. Now, the response is that nobody really cares about who these young boys are, but somebody is taking care of them. And imagine you as a parent or an older brother or sister of a youngster who was in somebody else's care. You'd want to know that they were taking full responsibility for them. And actually that Piggy, who seems so childlike because he's fat and he appears to be overindulged, a little bit earlier on in some of the other notes we were talking about, is actually the one who breaks away from that sort of childish realm and takes on the role of the adult. So how does that contrast with Ralph? Well, when he first considers that there are no adults, and Piggy asks him directly, so you think there are no adults? He says, I don't think so. And this adverb solemnly is used. Solemn is very serious. It's sort of, you would be very solemn at a funeral. But quickly, ever so quickly, in fact, in the same paragraph, the language shifts to delight. So Golding has juxtaposed these two ideas. He's gone from solemnity to delight when Ralph realises that this is the opportunity for adventure without being restricted by adults. And then he does something that seems perhaps completely reckless and the opposite of what an adult would want him to do, which is that he stands on his head, and then he continues to act irresponsibly and perhaps against everything else that an adult will tell him to do. So whereas Piggy can almost feel the full force of his aunt's wishes, even though she's thousands of miles away, Ralph is running around. He's running and not being careful, so that he's falling. Perhaps that's Golding using some kind of foreshadowing symbolism, about how Ralph is a figure of the establishment, and that he falls very quickly because he doesn't know how to lead. But he's also very disrespectful to Piggy's aunt in her absence. He says, "Sucks to your auntie," sort of, "Oh, stuff her." So he's very disrespectful as well. And then he seems irresponsible because he's not interested in the boys' names as well. His actions are quite dismissive. When Piggy's repeating the names, he's trying to share the names, he's repeating the names. Ralph is sort of he's doing the equivalent of shrugging his shoulders and saying, "Well, I don't really care. I'm blowing this conch and it's really good fun, and that's all I'm interested in right now." So whilst there would be different points of view on this and different ideas to add, that's a sort of starting point for how their response to there being no adults on the island suggests some differences between Piggy and Ralph. So what about the way that Piggy and Ralph react to the appearance of Jack and the choir? Well, in general, Piggy is intimidated and Ralph is wary, but there's a bit more to it than that, as there always is. Now, Golding has gone to great lengths to make us understand how responsible Piggy was in learning the boys' names and really making a big effort to learn the boys' names of the little uns before the choir comes along. But when the choir comes along, the first hint that Piggy is intimidated by them is that he doesn't ask their names. And then Golding is very explicit about the way Piggy feels about him being intimidated. In fact, that's the word he uses. He's intimidated by Jack's uniformed superiority. And my interpretation here is that Jack wearing his uniform kind of represents the establishment, so it would remind Piggy of what his position is back home as a working class boy. So the distinction between him and the others on the island is clearer than it is when we see Ralph in his uniform, because his uniform is a bit dishevelled. He's trailing his blazer behind him and his socks are falling down. But Jack comes along in this extraordinary uniform, and it does remind Piggy of his sort of place in society, that he is set apart and not in a good way from these boys. And then Jack is quite dismissive. That's what offhand means, it's casual, it's not caring. So he's got this offhand authority. So Jack has a naturally a sort of commanding air about him. And this word is about Piggy. He shrank behind Ralph in the presence of Jack. So he clearly is intimidated by him, and Golding isn't just hinting at that. He's telling us very, very clearly. But then, because I say all the time, none of this is really straightforward. Then Piggy asserts himself. He says, actually that's what we were going to do. When Jack says, then we'll have to take care of ourselves. I'm just finding my note here. He spoke up about Ralph calling the meeting in response to Jack saying, then we'll have to organise ourselves, we'll have to take care of ourselves. And Piggy said, well, that's what Ralph was doing when he was blowing the conch. So he does assert himself, but only when he's got Ralph to be the focal point of that response. If he'd said, I've already thought of that, because it is Piggy who thought of that. Oh, you could blow the conch to call a meeting to get the others to gather here. It's all Piggy's intelligence that's thought of this. But he attributes it to Ralph because he knows Ralph will carry more credit with someone like Jack. That if it's Piggy's idea, it's very likely to be dismissed by someone like Jack. So Piggy, through these actions, it shows that he's perceptive, but also that it perhaps shows us that he's used to this class divide in his country. There's more to say about that, but we'll deal with that later. Ralph, initially, Golding tells us that quite openly that he's curious. He's interested in this odd shape that's coming along the beach that turns out to be this group of boys. And quite early on, see, I think he's wary, but perhaps not as intimidated as Piggy, but I think he's intimidated to a degree. He realises, because again he's quite sharp like Piggy in some ways, that he needs to appease Jack. So Ralph is voted chief, but he knows he's got to give Jack something because he doesn't want to turn Jack into an enemy. And I think, as teachers do with a lot of young people, you probably wouldn't articulate this yourself or acknowledge that these are your thoughts, but on some level, some subconscious level, you're aware of what other people are like. And Ralph, even at his very young age, even at 12 years old, he understands, actually, do you know what, I've got to manage Jack. So he says, obviously you're in charge of the choir, and you can choose what the choir will be. And actually that works out to be a really good move, because he needs Jack just as he needs Piggy, and just as any leader needs strong people around them in their team. He understands that he's got to keep Jack on side, and actually it is Jack and the choir who are able to go out and hunt for meat. And then despite the aggression that Jack feels, it says later that Jack and Ralph have a shy liking for one another. So again, that reveals that even though Jack has been quite aggressive, therefore made Ralph wary, perhaps intimidated, so that Ralph's had to manage him, they both sort of feel this shy liking, because actually they really are just children underneath it all. And then Jack and Ralph become united. They go on this expedition together. They become united when they push the boulder off of the rock and cause this terribly destructive crash on the island, and just disrupt life. They send little bits of chalk and birds flying into the air, but it unites them. So I suppose every cloud has a silver lining, so they come together. They have a solemn communion. So it's gone from a shy liking to a solemn communion. So if we're thinking about Golding's methods, you can see the change in language there. And obviously communion is also a word that's used in religious ceremonies to suggest your belonging to God, your feeling of unity with God. And then, of course, just in tiny letters down here, there's the unity over the pig that they didn't manage to kill. They all understand the gravity of the situation, how ghastly it would be in physical terms to kill the pig, but also that they had moved sort of from innocent childhood into these realms of violence. But what's really important for the relationship between Jack and Ralph is, and to Simon as well, is that they witnessed Jack not being able to kill the pig. So it's a bit like where you say, oh yeah, I know where the bodies are buried. I know a secret about you that means you've got to keep me as your friend, because I can say things about you. So that kind of unites them as well, perhaps not for a good reason. But there's a phrase that people use, that you have to keep your friends close but your enemies closer. And I think even though they're not enemies at the beginning, there is some enmity between them, because Jack wanted to be chief. He thought he was the natural chief. And Ralph recognises this. So he sort of provides him with a salve. So he realises early on that he's got to be really careful about where he treads in this relationship with Jack. Sorry, I mean he does become bolder a bit later on. He gives Jack a bit of a telling off later, and Jack sort of has to stand down a little bit. And of course the whole relationship ends in disaster, really, and almost death for Ralph. But you know, this is what I think the reaction is at the beginning. But of course we're mostly focusing on the differences between the two, so I think there's a kind of perhaps grudging respect between Jack and Ralph here, because Ralph's just got that little bit more nous about how to treat him, and there's no respect whatsoever, just fear and utter disrespect between Piggy and Jack at the beginning. So there you have it, some ideas about the differences between Ralph and Piggy from chapter 1 of the book, focusing on class, appearance, thoughts, their response to there being no adults on the island, and their reaction to the appearance of Jack and his choir. And let me just remind you that everybody will have a different set of ideas, and even when you have the same ideas as somebody else, your train of thinking will take you to different places, and as long as you can back that up with some really solid evidence from the text and look closely at the methods that Golding is using and be detailed and exploratory, then there is no one answer that is better than another. It's the different ways that different people interpret things. So I'm going to try and develop some of those ideas a bit more in different videos, and hopefully end up with some kind of written response that won't incorporate all of the ideas probably that we've seen, and will incorporate some different ideas, because that's the way our brains sort of develop in terms of thinking. So I hope that's been helpful so far with not just answering section 4 of the Year 9 Lord of the Flies booklet, but in thinking about some of those differences and the characters of Ralph and Piggy in particular.